The morning sun cast long shadows across the high desert plains of New Mexico territory, painting the rugged landscape in shades of gold and amber that seemed to set the very earth ablaze with divine fire. A single rider emerged from the rolling hills, his weathered face squinting against the brilliant light that danced off every blade of prairie grass and every grain of sand scattered across the ancient terrain. This was Jacob Morrison, a man whose 43 years had carved deep lines around his steel-gray eyes and left silver streaks threading through his dark hair like veins of precious metal. His ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of unforgiving terrain, where longhorn cattle grazed among the sagebrush and prickly pear, and the wind whispered secrets that only the land itself could understand after countless centuries of witness. Jacob had built this life with his own calloused hands after returning from the war between the states, seeking solitude in a place where the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, across a stretch of desert that claimed the lives of unwary travelers with ruthless efficiency. The small town of Cedar Ridge lay 23 miles to the east, connected by a dusty trail that saw little traffic beyond the occasional supply wagon groaning under the weight of flour and coffee, and the monthly visit from the circuit preacher, who brought news from the outside world along with his worn leather Bible and promises of salvation. This isolation suited Jacob perfectly, though he had not always been such a solitary man. He had grown weary of crowds, of conversations that danced around the subjects that truly mattered, of people who looked at him with pity when they learned he had lost his wife Sarah to fever 3 winters ago. She had been buried in the small cemetery behind the whitewashed church in Cedar Ridge, her grave marked with a simple wooden cross that Jacob had carved himself during the long nights when grief made sleep impossible. The ranch house stood modest but sturdy against the elements, built from local sandstone and pine timber that Jacob had hauled down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains during his first summer in the territory. The structure had weathered countless storms, its thick walls and heavy timber roof designed to withstand the fierce winds that swept down from the high peaks carrying snow and ice even in late spring. A wide covered porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house, providing shade during the blazing summers when temperatures soared above 100 degrees and even the lizards sought shelter beneath the rocks. A small corral held his horses, including Thunder, the black stallion that had carried him through countless seasons of roundups and long rides across the territory. Thunder possessed the deep chest and powerful hindquarters of a horse bred for endurance rather than speed, his intelligent eyes reflecting a partnership with his master that had been forged through years of mutual trust and shared hardships. Beside him grazed a sturdy bay mare named Patience and a young sorrel gelding called Scout, each horse representing a significant investment in Jacob's ability to work the vast expanse of his land. The creek that ran along the southern border of his property provided fresh water year-round, fed by mountain springs that never failed even during the driest summers when other ranchers drove their cattle dozens of miles to find adequate water. The stream meandered through stands of cottonwood and willow trees that provided blessed shade during the scorching afternoons, creating an oasis of green in the otherwise brown and gold landscape. Jacob had often sat beside these waters in the evening, watching the sun paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples while he planned the next day's work or simply allowed his mind to wander back to happier times. On this particular morning, Jacob rode toward that very creek to check on a section of fence that had been damaged during the previous night's storm. The weather had been unusually violent for late spring, with lightning that split the darkness like the wrath of an angry god and thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. He had lain awake in his bed, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the house and the rain hammer against the shuttered windows with the intensity of rifle fire. The sound of rushing water grew louder as he approached the creek, and he noticed immediately that the normally placid stream had swollen to nearly 3 times its usual width. What had been a gentle flow, barely 2 feet deep now, raged as a brown torrent 6 feet deep and carrying debris from miles upstream in the mountains. Entire trees swept past, their roots torn from the earth by the sheer power of the flood, while boulders that had rested peacefully on the creek bottom for generations now tumbled along like pebbles in the grip of the furious current. The sound that stopped him cold was not the roar of water against stone, but something else entirely. A human cry, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from somewhere downstream where the creek disappeared around a bend lined with towering red rock formations. Jacob pulled Thunder to a halt and strained his ears, wondering if the storm and the rushing water had somehow combined to create an auditory illusion. Then it came again, clearer this time, a voice calling out in distress, with the desperation of someone facing imminent death. Without hesitation, Jacob spurred his horse toward the sound, following the swollen creek as it wound through a narrow canyon where the walls rose 30 feet on either side, like the ruins of some ancient cathedral. The water moved with terrifying speed here, churning and frothing as it squeezed through the rocky passage, creating whirlpools and standing waves that would challenge even the strongest swimmer. The noise was deafening, a constant roar that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth itself. And there, perhaps 200 yards ahead where the canyon opened into a wider valley, he saw her. A young woman thrashed desperately in the center of the torrent, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner, as the current carried her toward a series of jagged rocks that jutted up from the creek bed, like the fangs of some primordial beast. She wore the traditional dress of the Apache people, the beautifully crafted buckskin, now heavy with water, that threatened to drag her under with each passing second. Her beadwork caught the morning light in brief flashes of blue and red and yellow, colors that seemed impossibly vibrant against the brown fury of the flood. Her arms flailed weakly against the current, and Jacob could see that exhaustion was quickly overcoming her strength. She had been fighting the water for some time, and her movements were becoming increasingly desperate and uncoordinated. Her face, when it turned toward him, showed the stark terror of someone who understood that death was approaching with each yard the current carried her downstream. Jacob's mind raced through his options in the space of a heartbeat. The canyon walls were too steep and unstable to follow her on horseback, and by the time he could ride around to find another access point several miles away, she would be swept far downstream toward the main river, or worse, dashed to pieces against the rocks that marked the end of the canyon. There was only one choice, dangerous as it might be, and Jacob had never been a man to hesitate when action was required. He leaped from Thunder's back and began tearing off his boots and heavy winter coat, his eyes never leaving the struggling figure in the water. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the result of years spent in situations where quick action could mean the difference between life and death. The creek was perhaps 60 feet wide at this point, but the current would carry both of them much farther downstream before he could reach her, assuming he could reach her at all. Jacob grabbed his rope from the saddle horn and quickly fashioned a loop around his waist, securing the other end to his saddle with a knot that would hold under tremendous strain but could be released quickly if necessary. Thunder was trained to stand ground-tied, but the flooding creek and the scent of danger might test even his well-disciplined nature. If the horse bolted, both Jacob and the girl would be swept away to certain death. The icy water hit Jacob like a physical blow as he plunged into the torrent, driving the air from his lungs and sending shockwaves through his entire nervous system. The temperature was perhaps 40 degrees, cold enough to induce hypothermia within minutes and rob a man of his strength long before exhaustion set in. He immediately understood the full power of what he was fighting against as the current seized him like a giant invisible fist, threatening to sweep him away before he could even begin swimming toward the girl. Jacob fought against the relentless flow with powerful strokes, his shoulders and arms burning with the effort as he angled upstream to intercept her path. The rope around his waist provided some security, but it also created drag that made swimming even more difficult. He could feel Thunder's weight anchoring him to the shore, but he could also feel the horse shifting nervously as the rope pulled tight and loose with each surge of the current. The girl saw him coming and managed to raise one arm above the churning water, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror that struck Jacob like an arrow to the heart. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps no more than 20, with delicate features that spoke of both strength and gentleness. Her lips were already blue with cold, and he could see that she was rapidly approaching the point where the water would claim her regardless of his efforts. Jacob reached her just as they both swept around a bend in the creek, where the water deepened even further and the current became a living thing that seemed determined to tear them apart. He managed to get one arm around her waist, but she was dead weight now, unconscious from cold and exhaustion and the trauma of fighting for her life against impossible odds. Her body was limp and unresponsive, and Jacob realized with growing horror that he might already be too late. Swimming one-handed while supporting her weight proved nearly impossible against the relentless current. Jacob's lungs burned as he struggled to keep both their heads above water, fighting for each breath, as they were swept past rocky outcroppings and fallen trees that could crush them both if the current drove them into these obstacles. His strength was failing rapidly under the combined assault of cold water and physical exhaustion, and he began to wonder if he had saved her, only to ensure they would both drown together in this remote canyon, where their bodies might never be found. The rope around his waist had become both salvation and curse, providing connection to the shore, but also creating a constant drag that sapped his strength with every stroke. He could feel Thunder fighting to maintain his footing on the muddy bank, the horse's training warring with his natural instinct to flee from danger. If the stallion lost his footing or simply decided to run, both Jacob and the girl would be swept away to certain death in the rapids downstream. Then he saw it, a massive cottonwood tree that had fallen across the creek during some long-ago storm, its thick trunk creating a natural dam that slowed the water's flow and created a relatively calm pool on the upstream side. The tree was perhaps 50 yards ahead, close enough to reach if Jacob could summon the strength for one final effort, but far enough away that failure would mean being swept past their last hope of survival. Jacob kicked desperately toward the fallen tree, using the last reserves of his strength to fight against the current that seemed determined to carry them past this final opportunity for rescue. The girl's weight dragged at him like an anchor, and he could feel his grip on her slipping as the cold water numbed his hands and arms. His vision began to blur from exhaustion and oxygen deprivation, but he forced himself to keep swimming, to keep fighting against the overwhelming power of the flood. The impact with the cottonwood trunk nearly tore his arms from their sockets as the current slammed them both against the massive barrier. Jacob's shoulder struck the tree with enough force to send lightning bolts of pain through his entire body, but he held on, wrapping his arms around one of the thick branches that extended into the water. The unconscious girl pressed against him, her face pale as alabaster, and her breathing so shallow that he could barely detect it. Getting them both to shore took another 20 minutes of careful maneuvering, using the fallen tree's branches to work their way hand over hand toward the eastern bank where the slope was gentle enough for him to drag her clear of the water. Every movement required tremendous effort as the cold sapped the last of his strength, but Jacob refused to surrender when they were so close to safety. He finally managed to pull the girl onto a small sandy beach where the floodwater had deposited driftwood and debris from upstream. Jacob collapsed beside her on the muddy ground, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath and restore circulation to his numbed limbs. The girl lay perfectly still, her face the color of marble and her lips tinged blue with hypothermia. For a terrifying moment, he thought she might already be dead. Jacob rolled her onto her side and pressed against her back with both hands, forcing water from her lungs in a technique he had learned during his military service when soldiers sometimes had to be pulled from rivers and ponds. Creek water poured from her mouth as he worked, and after what seemed like an eternity, she suddenly convulsed and began coughing up the muddy liquid that had filled her respiratory system. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused, staring up at the morning sky with the confused expression of someone returning from the very edge of death. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak before her eyes closed again and she slipped back into unconsciousness. But she was breathing regularly now, and her pulse, though rapid and thready, was strong enough to give Jacob hope that she would survive this ordeal. The walk back to where he had left Thunder took nearly 2 hours, carrying the girl in his arms as she drifted in and out of awareness. She was small and light, but Jacob's strength had been severely depleted by his battle with the creek, and he was forced to rest frequently during the journey across the rough terrain. Thunder waited patiently where Jacob had left him, the rope still secured to the saddle horn but slack, now that it was no longer needed. By the time they reached the horse, Jacob's strength was nearly spent, but he managed to lift the girl onto the saddle before climbing up behind her to support her weight during the ride back to the ranch. She leaned against him limply, her head resting against his chest as Thunder picked his way carefully across the uneven ground. Jacob could feel her shivering through the wet buckskin dress, and he knew that getting her warm and dry had become a matter of life and death. The ranch house had never felt more welcoming than it did that afternoon as Jacob carried the Apache girl across the threshold of his modest home. He laid her on his own bed and covered her with every blanket he owned, then built up the fire in the stone hearth until the room was warm enough to drive the deadly chill from her bones. The flames leaped and danced in the fireplace, casting shifting shadows on the log walls and filling the air with the comforting scent of burning pine. She shivered violently for the better part of an hour, her body fighting to restore its normal temperature after the traumatic exposure to the frigid creek water. Jacob sat beside the bed, occasionally checking her pulse and breathing while he waited for the tremors to subside. Finally, the shivering stopped, and she fell into what appeared to be natural sleep, her breathing deep and regular and her color slowly returning to normal. Jacob moved to his chair by the fire, watching over her as the afternoon light faded into evening and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. He had saved her life, that much was certain, but he had no idea what would happen next. The Apache bands in this region were known to be fiercely protective of their people, and the appearance of one of their young women in the home of a white rancher could easily be misunderstood in ways that might prove fatal to everyone involved. The history between the Apache and the white settlers had been written in blood and betrayal, with atrocities committed by both sides that had created a cycle of violence and revenge that seemed to have no end. Jacob had heard stories of entire families murdered in their beds, of wagon trains attacked and burned, of Apache warriors killed under flags of truce. The appearance of an Apache woman in his house, regardless of the innocent circumstances, could be interpreted as an act of war by her people. Yet, as he looked at her peaceful face in the firelight, Jacob felt no regret for his actions. She could not have been more than 20 years old, with delicate features that spoke of intelligence and strength beneath the exotic beauty. Her dark hair spread across his pillow like spilled silk, and her breathing had grown steady and deep as her body recovered from its ordeal. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, at least she was alive, and that was worth any risk he might have to face. When the girl finally opened her eyes near midnight, she found Jacob dozing in his chair, his rifle resting across his knees and his weathered face relaxed in sleep. She studied his features in the dying firelight, taking in the lines that spoke of hard work and honest living, the silver in his hair that suggested wisdom earned through experience, the strong hands that had pulled her from certain death. This was not the face of a man who meant her harm, but years of conflict between their peoples had taught her to be cautious even in the face of apparent kindness. She sat up slowly, testing her strength, and was surprised to find herself wearing one of his flannel shirts over her own clothing, which had been laid out near the fire to dry. The gesture spoke of respect and consideration, qualities she had not expected to find in this place. Her dress, she could see, had been treated with care, spread out so that the beadwork would not be damaged and the leather would dry properly. Jacob stirred at the sound of her movement and opened his eyes to find her watching him with an expression he could not read. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions and uncertain intentions, while the fire crackled softly in the hearth and the night wind whispered around the corners of the house. Finally, the girl spoke in halting English, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the quiet room. "You pulled me from the water. You risked your life for mine." Jacob nodded, setting his rifle aside and leaning forward in his chair. The creek was running high from the storm. You were being swept downstream toward the rocks. I couldn't just watch you drown. She touched the flannel shirt she wore, understanding passing across her dark eyes. You gave me your clothes to keep me warm. You made a place for me in your home. Your dress was soaked through with ice-cold water. I thought you might catch your death if I didn't get you warm quickly. Jacob's voice was gentle, careful not to frighten her further than she already was. I meant no disrespect by removing your wet clothing. I only wanted to save your life. The girl studied him for another long moment, and Jacob had the sense that she was evaluating not just his words, but something deeper. His character, his intentions, his worthiness of the trust she was being asked to place in him. Finally, she seemed to reach some internal decision. I am called Morning Star. I am the daughter of Chief Running Wolf of the Mescalero Apache. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, carrying notes of pride and authority that reminded Jacob that she was not just any Apache woman, but one who held a position of importance within her tribe. My people will look for me when they discover I am missing. They will search everywhere until they find me or learn what became of me. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through the windows. How many people know where you were when the flood came? I was gathering medicine plants along the water when the storm sent the great flood down from the mountains. No one saw where I went, and no one expected me to return until the sun was high the next day. Morningstar's eyes grew troubled as she considered the implications. But when I do not return to our camp by the expected time, they will search everywhere. My father. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. My father is not a patient man when it comes to the safety of his family. The name of Chief Running Wolf was well known throughout the territory, spoken with respect by both the Apache people and the military authorities who had learned to fear his tactical brilliance and his unwavering dedication to protecting his tribe. He was also known to be fiercely protective of his family and his people, a leader who would not hesitate to wage war against any threat to those under his protection. The discovery that his daughter was missing, especially if she were found in the home of a white man, could easily be interpreted as an act of aggression that would demand immediate and violent retribution. Jacob stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness as if he might already see Apache warriors materializing from the shadows like vengeful spirits. When will they start looking for you? How long do we have before they come? They may have already begun. In our way, when someone does not return by the expected time, the search begins immediately. They will follow every trail, check every place where danger might hide. Morningstar rose from the bed, testing her balance and finding her legs stronger than she had expected. I must go to them before they find me here. If they discover me in your house, in your bed, wearing your clothing, you're in no condition to travel, especially not in the dark. The country between here and your camp is rough and dangerous, and you've been through a terrible ordeal. Jacob turned back to face her, his expression filled with concern. We'll wait until first light. I'll help you get back to your people then, and I'll explain what happened. Surely your father will listen to reason. Morningstar shook her head emphatically, her dark hair catching the firelight as it moved across her shoulders. You do not understand the situation. If my father's warriors find me here, they will believe you have taken me against my will. They will not pause to listen to explanations or consider alternatives. They will act first and seek understanding later, if at all. Jacob understood all too well the truth of her words. The tensions between the Apache bands and the white settlers had been simmering for years, occasionally boiling over into open conflict that left families destroyed and communities in ruins. A misunderstanding of this magnitude could easily spark violence that would spread far beyond his small ranch, potentially igniting a war that would consume the entire territory in flames. Yet he could not in good conscience send her out into the night, weak as she still was from her ordeal in the creek, and unfamiliar as she might be with the specific terrain between his ranch and her tribal lands. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and the terrain was treacherous even in daylight, filled with hidden arroyos and unstable rock formations that could trap the unwary. If she became lost or injured during the journey, her death would weigh on his conscience forever. We'll face whatever comes in the morning, Jacob finally said, his voice carrying the quiet determination that had seen him through war and personal tragedy. For tonight, you need rest and warmth to complete your recovery. Tomorrow we'll find a way to get you home safely, and we'll make your people understand what really happened. Morningstar wanted to argue, to insist that the danger was too great and the potential for misunderstanding too high. But exhaustion was overtaking her again, despite her efforts to remain alert. The warmth of the fire and the soft comfort of the bed were luxuries she had not expected to find in this place, and her body craved the rest that would help her recover completely from the day's traumatic events. As she settled back under the blankets, pulling the soft wool up to her chin, Jacob returned to his chair by the fire. He would not sleep this night, keeping watch for any signs of approaching riders, while his unexpected guest recovered her strength. The rifle remained within easy reach, though he hoped desperately that he would not need to use it. Violence would solve nothing and would only confirm the worst suspicions that Morningstar's people might harbor about his intentions. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the occasional pop and hiss of burning wood in the fireplace and the distant call of a nightbird hunting in the darkness beyond the windows. Jacob's mind wandered to the stories he had heard about Chief Running Wolf, tales that painted him as both a brilliant military tactician and a leader who genuinely cared for the welfare of his people. Some said he was a reasonable man who preferred negotiation to warfare when such options were available, while others claimed he had little tolerance for white encroachment on traditional Apache lands and would strike without warning when he perceived a threat. The truth, Jacob suspected, lay somewhere between these extremes. Running Wolf was undoubtedly a pragmatist who understood that his people's survival depended on his ability to navigate the complex and dangerous world created by the collision of two very different cultures. But he was also a father whose daughter had been missing for an entire day, and fathers were capable of extreme actions when their children were threatened. By dawn, Jacob had convinced himself that Morningstar was almost certainly correct in her assessment of the situation. Her father's warriors would indeed be searching for her, and they would not be inclined to listen to explanations when they found her in his house wearing his clothing. The best he could hope for was that they would allow him to speak before they acted, and even that small mercy was far from guaranteed. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, painting the interior of the house in shades of gold and amber, Morningstar stirred and opened her eyes. She looked significantly stronger than she had the night before, though Jacob could see the worry that clouded her delicate features like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "The sun rises," she said simply, sitting up in the bed and pushing her long dark hair back from her face. "Soon they will come, and we must be ready for them." Jacob nodded and moved to prepare breakfast, though he doubted either of them had much appetite for food given the circumstances they faced. As he worked at the cast-iron stove, frying bacon and preparing coffee that would help ward off the morning chill, he found himself stealing glances at Morningstar as she moved about the room with quiet efficiency. Despite her youth, she carried herself with the poise and dignity of someone accustomed to responsibility and respect within her community. There was something regal about the way she held her head, something that spoke of noble blood and careful upbringing. Her movements were graceful and economical, wasting no energy on unnecessary gestures. And Jacob found himself wondering what her life was like in the Apache camps, what duties and privileges came with being the daughter of a chief. They had barely finished their meager meal of bacon, biscuits, and strong black coffee when the sound of approaching horses reached their ears through the morning stillness. Jacob moved to the window and felt his blood turn cold at the sight that greeted him across the rolling grassland that stretched between his house and the distant hills. A dozen Apache warriors sat their horses in a line, perhaps 200 yards from the house, their weapons clearly visible, and their intentions completely unclear. They had approached with the silence of ghosts, appearing as if they had materialized from the earth itself, and Jacob realized that they had probably been watching the house for some time before revealing themselves. At the center of the group rode a man whose bearing and presence marked him unmistakably as their leader. Chief Running Wolf sat tall and straight on a magnificent paint horse whose coat gleamed like polished marble in the morning sunlight. The chief wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of both artistic skill and high status within the tribal hierarchy. His long gray hair was bound with strips of leather adorned with eagle feathers that caught the breeze and moved like living things. But it was Running Wolf's face that commanded attention and respect, weathered by decades of desert sun and high mountain winds, marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. It was the face of a man who had seen much of life and had learned to weigh all things carefully before acting. His dark eyes held intelligence and strength in equal measure, but also something else that Jacob found difficult to read. Perhaps suspicion, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the controlled anger of a father whose child had been in danger. Morningstar joined Jacob at the window, her face pale but determined as she looked out at her father and his warriors. "It is as I feared. He has brought his best fighters with him, the men he trusts most when danger threatens our people." Jacob studied the other warriors, noting the way they sat their horses with easy confidence and the casual manner in which they held their rifles and lances. These were not young men eager for battle, but seasoned fighters who understood the value of patience and careful observation. They would follow their chief's lead without question, but they were also capable of independent action if the situation demanded it. "Will they listen to you? Will your father give you a chance to explain what happened?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Morningstar nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. He will listen to me, yes. But whether he will believe what I tell him, whether he will accept that you acted with honor and kindness rather than evil intentions, that I cannot promise. Much will depend on his mood and what stories his warriors may have heard about white men who take Apache women. Jacob checked his rifle one final time, though he knew that 12 experienced Apache warriors would make short work of one man if they chose to attack. His only hope lay in the possibility that Running Wolf would be willing to listen before acting, that the bonds between father and daughter would prove stronger than the hatred that existed between their peoples. "Stay behind me when we go out there," Jacob told Morning Star as he moved toward the door. "Let me speak first. Let me try to explain." She shook her head firmly, and Jacob saw in her expression the same strength and determination that must have helped her survive in the floodwaters. "No, this is between my father and me. You have done nothing wrong, but he will not see it that way unless I make him understand. I must speak first, and I must speak truly about what happened and why." Together, they walked to the front door of the ranch house. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he lifted the wooden bar that secured the entrance and pulled the heavy door open, stepping out onto the covered porch with Morning Star beside him. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain from clouds that were building over the mountains. Chief Running Wolf's dark eyes fixed immediately on his daughter, and Jacob saw a complex mixture of emotions cross the older man's weathered face. Relief at seeing her alive and apparently unharmed, anger at the worry she had caused, confusion at finding her in such circumstances, and something that might have been fear at what might have transpired in this place. The chief's gaze then shifted to Jacob, and the rancher felt the full weight of that penetrating stare. It was the look of a man accustomed to reading the hearts and intentions of others, of someone who had survived by understanding when to trust and when to strike. Jacob forced himself to stand straight and meet that gaze directly, knowing that any sign of weakness or deception would be instantly detected and might prove fatal. For what seemed like an eternity, no one spoke. The silence stretched taut between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and dangerous possibilities. The other Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, but Jacob could sense the tension that coiled through their ranks like a living thing. They were waiting for their chief's signal, ready to respond instantly to whatever command he might give. The wind sighed through the cottonwood trees that shaded the ranch house, rustling the leaves with a sound like whispered prayers. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it circled high above the desert floor, searching for prey among the rocks and brush. The moment stretched endlessly, balanced on a knife's edge between understanding and violence. Finally, Chief Running Wolf spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them despite its measured, quiet tone. His words were in Apache, directed at his daughter, and though Jacob could not understand the language, the tone made the meaning unmistakable. The chief was demanding an explanation, and he would not be satisfied with anything less than complete truth. Morning Star responded in the same language, her voice steady and respectful but also firm with the conviction of someone who knew she spoke honestly. She gestured toward Jacob as she spoke, and he caught the Apache word for water and what he thought might be the word for rescue or saving. Her narrative continued for several minutes, during which her father listened with an expression that grew gradually less severe. Jacob could follow the general flow of the conversation through Morning Star's gestures and the changing expressions on her father's face. She was telling the story of her near drowning, describing how Jacob had risked his own life to pull her from the flood waters, how he had cared for her with respect and kindness when he could easily have taken advantage of her helpless condition. When Morning Star finished speaking, Chief Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between his daughter and Jacob as he weighed what he had heard against his own instincts and experiences. Finally, he raised his hand for silence and turned his full attention to Jacob, studying the white rancher with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. When the chief spoke again, it was in heavily accented but clear English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "My daughter tells me you pulled her from the floodwater when she was about to drown. She says you gave her shelter and warmth, but did not harm her in any way. Is this truth?" Jacob found his voice, though it came out rougher and more emotional than he intended. "That's true, Chief Running Wolf. I found her being swept downstream by the creek when it was running high from the storm. She would have drowned if someone hadn't acted quickly. Running Wolf studied Jacob's face as if searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. Morningstar says you risked your own life to save hers. She says you nearly drowned yourself pulling her from the water, that you fought the flood like a warrior fighting an enemy. Any decent man would have done the same, Jacob replied, though even as he said it, he wondered if that were really true. How many people would have risked their lives for a stranger, especially one from a different culture? No, Running Wolf said quietly, and his voice carried a sadness that spoke of too much experience with the worst aspects of human nature. Not any man would risk his life for one of my people. Many of your kind would have watched her drown and thought it was one less Apache to worry about. Some might even have helped the water do its work. The brutal honesty of the statement struck Jacob silent. He could not deny that there were white settlers who would indeed feel that way, just as he knew there were Apache who would gladly see him dead simply for the color of his skin. The cycle of hatred and revenge had poisoned relationships between the peoples for so long that acts of genuine compassion had become rare and suspect. Chief Running Wolf dismounted from his magnificent paint horse and walked slowly toward the porch, his movements deliberate and measured, like those of a cat approaching something that might be either prey or threat. Jacob fought the urge to step backward, instead standing his ground as the Apache leader approached with the quiet confidence of someone who had never learned to fear any man. When Running Wolf reached the bottom of the porch steps, he stopped and looked directly into Jacob's eyes from a distance of perhaps 10 feet. At close range, the chief was even more impressive, his presence filling the space around him like a force of nature. He was not a large man in terms of physical stature, but he possessed the kind of quiet power that comes from absolute certainty in one's own abilities and authority. My daughter's life is worth more to me than all the cattle on your ranch, more than all the gold in the mountains, more than all the horses in my herds, Running Wolf said, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the morning air. You have given her back to me when she would have been lost forever to the floodwaters. For this, I am in your debt. Jacob nodded, not trusting himself to speak as he felt the weight of the moment settling around them like morning mist. In my people's way, a debt of this magnitude cannot go unpaid. You have honored me by saving my child, and I must honor you in return with a gift worthy of what you have done. Running Wolf turned and spoke briefly to one of his warriors, who immediately rode back toward the line of waiting men with obvious purpose. Jacob watched in bewilderment as the warrior returned leading a magnificent sorrel mare, her coat gleaming like polished copper in the morning sunlight. The horse's breeding was unmistakable. She was one of the prized animals for which the Apache were famous throughout the territory, bred for intelligence and endurance rather than mere beauty. Her head was small and refined, her neck arched with natural pride, and her movements suggested both power and grace in perfect balance. This mare is called Wind Dancer, Running Wolf said as his warrior brought the horse forward to stand before the porch. She was born on my land 3 summers ago, trained by my own hands since she was old enough to accept a rider. She has never known defeat in any race, and her children will be fleet as the wind itself and strong as the mountains. Jacob stared at the beautiful animal, overwhelmed by both the generosity of the gesture and the obvious value of what was being offered. Among the Apache, horses were not merely transportation but symbols of wealth and status, carefully bred and trained animals that represented significant investments of time and resources. To offer such a gift to an outsider was unprecedented in Jacob's experience. Chief Running Wolf, I cannot accept such a valuable gift. I only did what any decent man should do when he sees another person in danger. Jacob's voice carried his genuine reluctance to accept something so precious. Surely there is some other way I can earn your gratitude without taking one of your finest horses. The Apache leader's expression grew stern, and Jacob immediately realized his mistake. In Apache culture, as in many others, refusing a gift offered in gratitude was tantamount to insulting both the giver and the occasion that prompted it. By suggesting that the mare was too valuable, he was inadvertently implying that Morningstar's life was not worth such a sacrifice. You would dishonor me by refusing my gift? You would suggest that my daughter's life is worth nothing to her father? Running Wolf's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Jacob's blood run cold. Perhaps I was mistaken about your character. Perhaps you saved Morning Star for reasons that were not as pure as she believes. Jacob realized immediately that he was standing on the edge of a precipice that could easily crumble beneath him, sending both him and the delicate understanding they had built tumbling into an abyss of misunderstanding and violence. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace and surrender, knowing that his next words might determine whether he lived or died. "Forgive me, Chief Running Wolf. I did not mean to dishonor you or your daughter. It's just that the mare is so beautiful, so valuable, that I felt unworthy to receive such a magnificent gift." Jacob's voice carried his sincere regret for the misunderstanding. "If you believe I have earned the right to accept Wind Dancer, then I am deeply honored by your generosity." The tension that had crackled between them like lightning eased slightly, and Jacob saw Running Wolf's expression soften as he recognized the sincerity of the apology. The Apache leader studied Jacob's face for another long moment before nodding slowly, apparently satisfied that the slight had been inadvertent rather than intentional. "She is valuable, because my daughter is valuable," Running Wolf replied, his voice returning to its earlier measured tone. "You gave me back what I treasure most in this world, and Wind Dancer is my way of saying that your act will not be forgotten by me or my people." Jacob walked down from the porch and approached the mare, extending his hand for her to examine with her soft muzzle. Wind Dancer's eyes were intelligent and calm, and she accepted his touch without resistance, her nostrils flaring slightly as she learned his scent. Her conformation was perfect, her muscles lean and powerful beneath the silken coat that seemed to glow with its own inner fire. "She's magnificent," Jacob said softly, running his hand along the mare's neck and feeling the power that lay coiled beneath her smooth skin. "I'll treasure her always, and I'll make sure she receives the care and respect she deserves." Running Wolf nodded approvingly, and Jacob sensed that he had passed some crucial test in the Apache leader's estimation. "There is more. From this day forward, you may travel safely through any land where my people ride. Your cattle may graze on Apache grass when the drought comes to your pastures, and your horses may drink from Apache springs when your own water runs low." The formal words carried enormous significance beyond their surface meaning. In a territory where Apache raids could destroy a ranch overnight, such protection was worth more than gold or cattle or land. But Jacob sensed there was something deeper being offered here, something beyond mere practical considerations. "I am honored by your friendship, Chief Running Wolf, and I hope I will always prove worthy of it," Jacob replied carefully, understanding that he was entering into an agreement that would bind him for the rest of his life. The Apache leader studied Jacob's face one final time, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "I believe you will prove worthy. Morning Star has told me that you have no wife, no children to share your life. Loneliness is a hard burden for any man to carry, especially one who lives so far from others of his kind." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks, uncertain where this line of conversation might lead, and not sure he was prepared for whatever direction it might take. "I manage well enough on my own, Chief. I have my ranch, my animals, my work to keep me occupied." "Perhaps. But a man needs more than cattle and horses for company. He needs people who understand him, who share his values and his dreams." Running Wolf glanced meaningfully at his daughter, who had been listening to their conversation with an expression Jacob found impossible to read. "My daughter is 20 summers old enough to choose her own path in life. She has spoken highly of your character and your kindness, and she is free to make her own decisions about her future." The implication hit Jacob like a thunderbolt, leaving him speechless as he tried to process what the Apache leader seemed to be suggesting. Was Chief Running Wolf actually proposing some kind of arrangement between Jacob and Morning Star? The cultural divide between them seemed too vast, the potential for misunderstanding too great, the social barriers too formidable to overcome. Morning Star stepped forward then, her voice quiet but clear as she addressed both men. "My father speaks truly when he says I have the right to choose my own path. I have never met a white man who would risk his life for one of our people without thought of reward or recognition. Such courage and honor are rare qualities in any man, regardless of the color of his skin or the language he speaks." Jacob looked from daughter to father, trying to understand the undercurrents he sensed flowing beneath their words like hidden streams beneath the desert floor. "I'm deeply flattered by your good opinion, Morning Star, but surely your people would never accept such an arrangement. The differences between our cultures are too great, The history between our peoples too filled with conflict and misunderstanding. My people respect strength and honor above all else, Running Wolf interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. They have already heard the story of your brave rescue of my daughter from the floodwaters. That story will grow with each telling, as all good stories do. By winter, they will say you battled a great water serpent to save her life. Despite the tension of the moment, Jacob found himself smiling at the image the Apache leader painted. And by next winter? By then, you will have defeated an entire army of water spirits and their demon king. Morningstar added, her own lips quirking upward in what might have been the beginning of a genuine smile. The story will become legend, and legends have a power of their own. The moment of shared humor seemed to break some invisible barrier that had existed between them, allowing Jacob to see past the exotic clothing and unfamiliar customs to recognize the universal human qualities that lay beneath. Here was a father's love for his daughter, a young woman's gratitude for her life, the bonds that could form between people of goodwill regardless of their backgrounds or the artificial boundaries that others might try to impose. I would be honored by your friendship, Jacob said, addressing both father and daughter with genuine sincerity. If you would ever consider visiting my ranch again, whether together or separately, you would always be welcome at my table and by my fire. Running Wolf nodded gravely, his weathered face reflecting approval, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. We will remember your invitation and your hospitality. But for now, we must return to our people. They are anxious to learn that Morningstar is safe and to hear the story of her rescue. As the Apache band prepared to leave, Morningstar approached Jacob one final time, moving with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize all her actions. Up close, he could see flecks of gold in her dark eyes and smell the faint scent of sage and wildflowers that clung to her long black hair. Thank you, she said simply, her voice carrying depths of meaning that went far beyond the simple words. Not just for saving my life from the floodwaters, but for treating me with respect and kindness when you had no reason to do either. Many men would have taken advantage of my helpless condition, but you behaved with honor even when no one was watching. Jacob felt an unexpected tightness in his throat as he looked into her eyes and saw the genuine gratitude that shone there like starlight. Thank you for trusting me enough to tell your father the truth about what happened. You could have let him believe whatever he chose to believe, but you spoke honestly even though it might have been easier to remain silent. She reached out and touched his hand briefly, a gesture so simple yet so electric that it seemed to burn like fire against his skin. Her fingers were small and delicate but surprisingly strong, and Jacob found himself reluctant to break the contact when she finally withdrew her touch. Perhaps we will see each other again, Jacob Morrison, she said softly, her voice carrying a note of possibility that made his heart race in ways he had not experienced since Sarah's death. I would like that very much, he replied, meaning it more than he had expected to and finding himself already looking forward to whatever future encounters might bring. Within minutes, the Apache band had departed as silently as they had arrived, leaving only dust clouds on the horizon to mark their passing, and the memory of their presence lingering in the morning air like the echo of distant thunder. Jacob stood in his yard holding Wind Dancer's lead rope, still hardly able to believe what had just transpired in this remote corner of the New Mexico territory. He led the mare to his corral and turned her in with his other horses, watching as she established herself with quiet confidence among the small herd. Thunder approached her with cautious interest, while Patience and Scout seemed to recognize immediately that this newcomer was something special, a horse bred for purposes far beyond mere ranch work. Everything about Wind Dancer spoke of careful breeding and expert training, from her perfect balance and fluid movement to the alert intelligence that shone in her dark eyes. She carried herself with natural pride, but showed no signs of the temperamental behavior that sometimes accompanied horses of exceptional quality. This was an animal that had been raised with love and patience, trained with skill and understanding rather than force and intimidation. As he walked back toward the house, Jacob reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken in the space of just 2 days. He had awakened yesterday morning as a lonely rancher with few prospects beyond the daily routine of managing his cattle and maintaining his property in the face of an unforgiving environment. Now he found himself the owner of a magnificent horse worth more than most men earned in several years, the holder of safe passage through Apache territory that would protect him and his property for the rest of his life, and something else that he was only beginning to understand. The memory of Morningstar's touch lingered on his hand like a physical presence, warm and electric and filled with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. He could still see her face in the morning light, the way her eyes had met his when she spoke of seeing him again, the subtle promise that had been woven through her carefully chosen words. There had been something in her expression that suggested their paths would indeed cross again, and probably sooner rather than later. Jacob settled into his chair on the covered porch and looked out across the rolling plains toward the distant mountains where the Apache made their camps among the pine trees and high meadows. The vast landscape that had seemed so empty and forbidding just yesterday now held the promise of connection, of understanding that transcended the artificial boundaries that men drew between themselves based on skin color and cultural differences. Wind Dancer nickered softly from the corral, as if she too sensed that significant changes were coming to this quiet corner of the territory. Jacob smiled and closed his eyes, letting the warm morning sun wash over his weathered face as he contemplated the unexpected gifts that courage and compassion could bring into a man's life when he was willing to act without thought of personal consequence. Reward. The rescue of Morning Star had been an instinctive act, requiring no deliberation or consideration of potential complications. But the reverberations of that simple decision would continue to spread outward like ripples in a still pond, touching lives and altering destinies in ways he could not yet begin to imagine. For the first time in years, Jacob Morrison looked toward the future with anticipation rather than resignation, knowing that the horizon that had once marked the boundary of his solitary world now beckoned with possibilities he had never dared to dream.